Hello YouTube, this is Morgan, Airspeed Prime here with my next Avatar weekly discussion topic video. This one is going to be my kind of discussion on things that I suppose the comics, as they go on over the years, are going to kind of have to, I think, touch on to a degree. So some of these will be speculation, some of them are kind of like stuff that makes logical sense to happen, some of it like they almost can't avoid covering, and then some of it is going to be kind of theory focused stuff. So it's just kind of I suppose reminding you of like stuff that in the Avatar comics has to happen between where we are now and Korra happening. So let's just jump straight in and you'll sort of see what we're going for here. So the first one I have here is Mai and Zuko get back together. So where we are right now is that most of the issues between them are like, I wouldn't say resolved, but like they've spoken. It's not just they've broken up and aren't talking. They're talking together again. It's clear that there's still a connection between the two. They just haven't kind of fully committed to getting back together just yet. And while there is that kind of interview where Jean Yang says that they kind of, they later get back together or whatever he said, it still has to be shown in new material that they are actually back together. And the reason this one's so important is just because, one, it's a relationship people care about. Mai and Zuko, I care about it. It's a relationship I really like. But because it's just a weird thing that throughout all the Korra we had like, oh, here's Azumi, but we don't know who Azumi's mother is. It kind of has to be Mai, but we don't know for sure. It'd be really nice to just kind of confirm Mai and Zuko get back together and really commit to the relationship, like that they're not going to break up again. This is just it. Canon relationship, here it is. And just stick to it. That way we can just be like, okay, Azumi's mother is Mai to all extents and purposes. That's it. And that's just, I think, something they kind of have to do. And again, it's so much more interesting when characters are actually like, I think, in a relationship with each other and, you know, developing that way than just kind of constantly going through breakup processes and so on. Whereas, you know, technically in canon, you've done that twice now with Mai and Zuko. You've kind of, you know, had little breakup things happen with them and brought them back together. Let's just commit to them going forward now, because I think the thing with both of them is that they're both going to have to now deal with the fact that like Azula's out there and is obviously messing with Zuko, but she kind of knows that Zuko is the one who's kind of correct to be the Fire Lord. She just wants to kind of change things for him. Whereas with Mai, Azula like obviously has reason to kind of dislike Mai because of the betrayal, and so them dealing with the exact same thing like as a couple, I think would be so interesting if she kind of tackles them in that way. Which leads into the second point here, which is Azula's arc. Obviously we've been saying this basically since the end of Smoke and Shadow, when they committed to kind of putting Azula in this position where she's on a new path now, and we're really not sure exactly what way they're going with her, that there's so much potential, because they haven't done, I suppose, the really obvious thing you'd expect them to do just yet. And she's such an important character, she's such a beloved character. They have to do something. They can't just leave her like this as just, you know, kind of this wild card out there that could mess with Zuko at any point in time. Because she does still need development, that she's still this character who fundamentally doesn't know how to like properly communicate with people, still believes 100% that controlling people through fear manipulation is the way to go. She doesn't realize that that's the flawed thinking, not the way Zuko's trying to do things, and that her trying to force Zuko to be like that isn't really the best way to go about things. So there's clear development that still has to happen. And I think you need to highlight some of the aspects of her that she is. She's a somewhat tragic character in a way as well. While she's done a lot of bad things, that she is this character who hasn't really ever been taught like just how to interact properly with people, and so that's why she wasn't really able to like keep her friends and stuff like that. That she only knows kind of how to be a kind of like military leader in a way. Only really knows how to be a commander as opposed to just a friend. A sister and so on. So there's clear things that they still have to do. They still have to have her have a talk with her mother Ursa and really get to the, you know, core of where their issue is or is not. I think Kiyi could also be a very interesting factor in all of this, with regards to, does Azula kind of treat Kiyi as kind of like a replacement in a way within the family, that Azula's kind of been ignored, ostracized, whereas Kiyi just is here now and she has a great relationship with Zuko and so on. And especially now that Kiyi is a firebender, and I assume she'll probably get training from Zuko, and we'll start to see her become a little bit more prevalent in kind of Zuko's side of things. Where exactly are we going with that? So there's a bunch of different things, and of course, like you still have like Azula can have some scenes with Mai, Zuko, Ty Lee, Katara. I suppose you could also kind of play on the rivalry with Azula as well if you needed to. But the big thing, of course, is just we don't know anything about what happens to Azula's kind of character, really, where she ends up towards the end of in going into Korra time. Like, we don't know if she starts a family at any point, or what happens. We don't know if she's dead or not. Like, I think the idea that Smoke and Shadow presented is that Azula, if she manages to get a good amount of development, could make for a very good advisor to Zuko. Like, she actually could make a really good advisor, which is the role she has kind of forced herself into with Zuko, and that she's kind of taking on this kind of dark, the shadow of the Fire Lords to a degree. Anyone who's familiar with Naruto, she's kind of trying to become the kind of Donzo figure to the Hokage, of like, here's someone who will do all the bad stuff that is required to be a good leader, while Zuko will always come across as kind of being the good person, and she's trying to influence him to make those harsh decisions, but that fundamentally she will be the one kind of executing a lot of the bad stuff needed to kind of keep the peace to a degree. If that's the way they're going, like, there's an option to, of course, do things, but in a way she feels like she would be just a better, if they could manage to remove the sort of villainous kind of edge to her character, and through scenes with Ursa and so on. Even Iroh, of course. Iroh's another thing that they could bring into play. In that, I don't think they need to go fully commit to just like, oh, Iroh helps Azula in the same way that he did as Zuko. But a scene between them where Iroh like notes that he's aware of kind of why Azula is the way she is. I think some sort of wisdom that he could supply to her, where she finally listens to something Iroh has to say, could make for at least a good scene, even if like it's not going to be the like Iroh to Azula won't be as important as Iroh is to Zuko in that way. I don't think you need to repeat it where just Iroh is the one to give anyone a redemption arc type thing. But for sure, super, super important arc. I don't think it will be the next comic arc. I really don't think they're going to start Faith Erin Hicks off with the new Avatar comics in 2018 by immediately committing her to do this really, really important arc. For one, because if you are going to commit to having that be the core of a story arc, it kind of feels like you have to devote a lot of time to just kind of Azula on her own, separate from most of the main cast, in that I feel you probably do have to delve into a little bit of like backstory on her own in the mental institution. You probably have to delve into like flashbacks with her from her perspective, and not so much be like, oh, she'll be like the side plot to an Aang plot going on. So I feel they'll start her off with, I think the 2018 Avatar comic will probably play it somewhat safe, and then maybe we'll go into the bigger arc, in the same way that Jin Yang, The Search was the second comic he did, The Promise was the first one, where it was a little bit safer. So that's that. Next up here I have Kalo, and I suppose his vague ending in Smoke and Shadow. While not everyone's going to care about Kalo, he was a very important character in Smoke and Shadow. They used him pretty well, but then had him kind of leave the story, kind of leave the series temporarily, in a very weird way, where like him and Mai kind of broke off kind of off screen, where we weren't really seeing the breakup from their perspective. They both seemed quite upset, and then Mai's aunt kind of asks Kalo like, where is he going? Will we see you again? And he just gives like some kind of vague answers and kind of goes off, seemingly to just kind of find himself, because the arc they'd sort of set up for him is that he's sort of been like abandoned a little bit, and he always wants to kind of become part of a group and kind of just attach himself to something or someone, whether that be the New Ozai Society initially, or then Mai. Not that there was potential for an arc here, so they can bring him back and do something with him, or they can go for something big. Like, I wouldn't at all be shocked if, like, the next time we see Kalo, it's like he's suddenly there with Azula, wanting some sort of revenge against, like, Mai and Zuko to a degree, that they maybe commit to a villain turn for the character, or something like that. At the same time, I could see that sort of to a degree being the end of his character, and you don't need to bring him back. But it was so vague that it felt like they kind of were setting up that he will come back. But that's up in the air. In the comments, definitely let me know what your thoughts are. Do you think Kalo will come back? The next one I have here is that I hope Suki at some point soon is transitioned from her role right now, which is that she's transitioned away from being Zuko's bodyguard and kind of becomes the, just Kyoshi warrior again, or just kind of has time like the rest of Team Avatar where she's just part of the team and is traveling around with Sokka, who, is her boyfriend, and we haven't really seen that dynamic recently. That, even if it's just something small, like she wants to take a break from being Zuko's bodyguard, so she has some sort of a trip with Sokka. That would be a really cool way to have a story where it's just Sokka, Suki time to develop her individually as a character, Sokka individually as a character, and especially like the last year or two, where I think the fandom has really kind of, I think, got behind Suki in a way where, like, we considered this character 100% a part of Team Avatar, treat her in the same way as the other members, include her more in these things, and don't just go backwards with the character where she's just the kind of minor, cool, recurring character that we really like. Commit to her being a much more interesting character and do something with her. It's somewhat similar with the next point, which is just, I think, Sokka being shifted more into a leadership position role within the series, or just being treated a little bit more seriously within the comics. While he's had some great moments over the course of the comics, they've always tended to use him in the comedic position. Of course, he had some great scenes in North and South, but he was never really a focus of the story. They never did what I think it was perhaps expected of him, where they would do something big with him to position him as an upcoming leader within the South. Because we know Sokka becomes the Southern representative on the United Republic Council. We know at some point he becomes the chief of the Southern Water Tribe. It doesn't necessarily feel like he's considered in that sort of a role just yet. And yes, there's still a lot of time to get him to that point. But given what he did in, like, the invasion and the leadership he showed there, the leadership he showed in terms of, like, when the group was training for the big final battle, leading the airship group, in the final battle, bring us back to that. Have like Hakoda see Sokka and, begin to teach him a little bit of how to be, like, a better leader and so on. They're the sort of things that I want to see with Sokka going forward. The next few are just kind of three kind of fun ones that you could make them into a nice kind of solid little story. You could make them into a bigger story, but they're just kind of three things that I think the fans would just love to see. Like, I think these three things would get the fandom so excited if you said you were doing any one of them. First one I have here is Aang finding the other Sky Bison and lemurs. So we more or less know that this is something that does happen in between series, and that Aang is, like, present there, that he, to some degree, is the one who finds them first. So when this happens, this has to be such a cool moment, because for Aang, who's experienced kind of so much loss, having to accept, that he's this kind of person at a time, 100 years on, that he's lost all of his people, Appa's potentially the last Sky Bison. What a moment that would be for, like, Aang, Appa, and Momo to realize that they're not the last of all their individual species, that there's hope for the airbenders. The amount of hope that this would give to Aang to find other Sky Bison and kind of feel that, there is hope going into the future for his culture and so on. He has the Air Acolytes, but now he has Sky Bison to kind of, like, incorporate into the kind of new teachings he's giving and so on. I suppose you can also add into this anything potentially to do with Air Temple Island as well. Like, Aang technically has no home as such, because the entirety of ATLA and the comics, he's just been kind of traveling around the place, and he's a nomad, so he's used to it. But I do think it's at the point now where he sort of needs to have like a home base, and given that he's in this relationship with Katara, it makes sense that to some degree this would be something he starts to think about, because as the Avatar, he can't be based from the Southern Water Tribe where Katara's home is. That's too far away from the action. I could see him staying in the Fire Nation until they decide that Yudao is going to become Republic City. But this is where like I'd be thinking kind of sooner rather than later, like Aang probably has to turn his attention to, let's go back to the air temples, let's fix them up, let's start to use them again, and here's this central air temple island. And I feel that has to happen sooner rather than later, especially with the idea of like Yudao eventually morphing into United Republic and all the nations becoming incorporated. So you sort of already have the Fire and the Earth Nation coming together in Yudao, and now you're beginning to bring the Water Tribe into things with some of what they did in North and South. Aang, of course, as the Avatar, is involved in this, but like the Air Acolytes are still kind of just traveling around with Aang kind of randomly. Commit to having like a central base location for the air temple, for the air nomads at this point. So that's just kind of fun stuff with Aang in terms of doing a little bit more to commit to the air nomad culture coming back. And I think the moment where Aang finds those other sky bison and lemurs, I think, is that big central point where what a moment that will be for Aang, to just see how potentially emotional it would be for him. Even just to focus a little bit on Appa's reaction to seeing other sky bison, and even Momo, like that would be a great moment for all of them. And then I think it'd be cool to see Katara's reaction to kind of, I suppose, seeing Aang so happy about all of this, and just everyone like seeing more sky bison. That would be a big moment for everyone to see. So that's definitely a big thing. That would, I think would also be an interesting moment for kind of Aang and Katara's relationship, to kind of just kind of for her to kind of be there with Aang during this kind of cool moment of like discovery, of like more hope for the airbenders coming back. On a similar note, Zuko getting his dragon Druk. We obviously don't know when exactly this happens, but like Druk's like a fully grown dragon. It doesn't seem like he's a young dragon or anything like that. And obviously the theory behind this right now is that the egg thing, the Ancient Sun Warrior artifact that he touches in 313, the Firebending Masters, is the egg that Druk eventually hatches from. So what they have to do here, obviously, is like bring the Ancient Sun Warriors back into play, of like, okay, the egg you touched is hatching, and because you were the one who touched it, and like you said you like heard it like breathing or something like that, you have to be the one to be present when it like hatches. And they maybe do this kind of like final stage of like Sun Warrior training or something like that, where he does some final thing to become like Druk's kind of master as a kind of dragon kind of, and that's where like their connection comes from. Again, like you can set up how exactly Zuko kind of gets in touch with like, you know, getting a dragon basically, but it has to be something that happens, I think, to some degree sooner rather than later. Just because like Aang and Zuko, while obviously you're going to keep them together a lot, it also just helps with Zuko, like if he has a dragon to fly around on. So that's why you'd kind of want to, I think, commit to just him having this baby dragon kind of in training sooner rather than later. So like you give it a chance to be somewhat fully grown by the time you're getting into the kind of meat of what's really happening with like the Republic City stuff and so on. That, and I suppose it doesn't make a ton of sense that like Zuko just gets a dragon like very late in life to fly around on. So that's something I really want to see, because as I said, it would bring the Ancient Sun Warriors back into play. I assume Iroh will be somewhat involved in that as well, even that he seems to be like the most recent character with experience with dragons. And it would allow us to, I think, learn a little bit more about them, I suppose, just as a species, full stop. Just seeing like one growing up and so on. And then not an animal, but just something important to a character, Sokka and his space sword. Obviously, we're very up in the air about whether this is something that he finds again, or he just gets a separate sword, or like remakes the space sword. But it seems like he ends up later on in his life getting some sort of a sword back. And it would be cool if there was like a journey to just look for the sword. And of course, the dream thing for everyone is Sokka and Suki go on like kind of vacation or something like that together to find the sword, and it gives you time to develop those two characters, and then it gives Sokka back this sword, because that's his kind of key thing as a warrior now, is that he's a swordsman, and he's mainly using his boomerang again and his club. But you know, what about the sword training? I think that was something that was sort of forgotten in the recent comics, that just because he's lost his sword, he just doesn't use one full stop. Even if it's not his sword, I still feel he should kind of have one as a warrior, because it feels like he's so much more of a threat when he has the sword than when he doesn't. And while I think they've definitely like kept up that he's a very strong fighter now in the comics, it just feels like that's the thing to commit to with him. Get him his sword back, because it would be a cool thing. It feels like, yes, it was a notable moment of just him throwing the sword away to kind of save his friends, but it feels like the sort of sword that shouldn't just stay missing forever, that it wouldn't be like crazy damaged in how it fell or something like that, that he should be able to find this sword and get it back in his weapons arsenal. Next one I have here is just Kiyi. I kind of touched on this before, but the idea of her beginning to train in firebending, and then just the idea, like, we didn't really see that many characters react to her being a firebender. So, like, does Ursa know? Like, what about Noran? Ikem, whatever way you want to call him. I think Noran is the name he's going by currently. Even Zuko, like, we don't really know, like, what the reaction is to that. Like, does she keep it a secret for a while and only tell certain people, or what? And again, does she start the training? Because that would be a cool thing. It would allow her to have scenes with Zuko specifically, of seeing how we know he's good at training. He trained Aang, so there's that. To see him passing on his firebending even more, and it would just be a cool thing to kind of have a kind of much younger character kind of be involved in this sort of stuff, that she has this power now. You'd want to immediately start her training, and especially in firebending where you need to have control. It feels like that just is a default thing with firebenders, that like the second they discover their ability, you kind of want to be right on it with like, learn control, learn how to use the ability so you don't hurt people. So that's going to be a big thing, and that could lead to some cute moments, and especially if like Azula finds out she's a firebender, it could lead to some even better moments. Next up, I suppose, are more kind of longer scale things, and that I don't really expect a lot of this stuff to just immediately happen in the next couple of comics. I think this feels like we're going to have bigger time skips to really get to these things, but obviously Republic City is something we have to build towards, and as I touched on before, we have, Yu Dao, which is this place where it's mixed Fire Nation and Earth Kingdom. And now the Water Tribe is sort of coming into play with Hakoda making the deals with the connections and so on, like making the connection with like the Earth and Fire Refinery, which is a Fire Nation Earth Kingdom joint business. The ports and stuff like that, so they're going to start trading with the other nations. So the Water Tribe are coming back into play in that they now have a more reliable, I suppose, way of transport kind of out of the Southern Water Tribe, so they're not as isolated anymore. And that makes immediate sense for like, okay, so when they start this kind of United Republic, Republic City, the Water Tribe can be a part of it. It's just about when they fully commit to actually them all the leaders kind of coming together and saying that, okay, this place is more than just a random town or a group of towns that we decided can be joint Fire and Earth Nation. This has to be a central point in the world where anyone from any nation can come to, and it's this area that shows kind of the modern view on things, where it's not about separation, it's about togetherness, and present the idea that the nations working together moves things along much better than they do being apart, and really present the idea that technology is, at this point in the universe, even the comics, technology is kind of booming at this point. The war obviously advanced things a decent amount, and then in the aftermath of this, we're seeing stuff like early forklifts coming into play with like Satoru. Obviously, the cabbage merchant is sort of beginning to have his ideas in his head spinning towards some sort of a technology corporation, potentially using Satoru as like his main inventor. So the Satomobiles and stuff like that are probably gonna, cars, Satomobiles is gonna come into play. I wouldn't say very soon, but like that's the sort of stuff that we're going to have to see soonish. The cabbage mobiles or whatever you want to call them. So that sort of stuff. And then going back to the Republic City thing, of course, the other aspects of that would be the police force. When does the Metalbender police force form? In that they've already directly, I think, set that up. In that Toph's school has some involvement with regards to how metalbenders are trained, how we get enough trained metalbenders to actually have a police force. It would explain why Toph would be the leader of this police force, but I think she still needs development to get to that point, because right now it's kind of like businesswoman Toph rather than like chief of police Toph. So there has to be a transition point for Toph as a character where that really becomes a thing, because police chief seems like a better position for Toph than running a business type thing at the moment. And then I think that's where they're setting up that Toph, once her students, I think the 3 students, once they're trained up well enough, I think she's just going to give the school to them, that they will be the ones training new metal bending recruits. That she trained those 3. They were her first students and she trained them directly, and she's happiest with them. And it will be a big point, I think, with regards to comic characters, where she just says to them that, like, okay, I have to do this police force thing in the city, but I want you guys to continue running the dojo, running the school, training more metal benders, and giving me good recruits to join the police force. I think that's something that has to happen at some point. And then similarly, like, I think you're probably going to have to reintroduce the Morishitas, so like the likes of Kori from The Promise will probably have to come back once you're getting into the idea of like Yudao morphing into more than just 2 nations being together. So then the last 2 that I have here, again, this is by no means exhaustive. There's loads of other stuff that has to happen. There's loads of other predictions, but the last 2 I think are very interesting. One is that one would be the death of King Bumi. Now, I'm not saying that this is something that needs to happen soon, or because I don't think any of us would be happy when we see King Bumi die, but he is one of our oldest kind of living characters at this point in time. I think we know just from the fact that like Aang names his first son Bumi that at some point he does die. I think that's the implication, that it's kind of like Bumi's named in honor of King Bumi. So at some point between series he does die, and it's a notable death because outside of Aang, King Bumi really is the like only one left from that generation of people from Aang's era. That, like, unless you consider Guru Patik, who's even older than King Bumi, but Aang didn't know Guru Patik. So realistically for Aang, the death of Bumi is this very, very notable moment for him, where it truly is that he is on his own in this era. That he has all these new people, of course, but the last thing in a way left from his life before the ice is now gone. And that's, I think, why the naming of his first son Bumi after King Bumi is such a notable moment. But I think also if they had that be a notable moment to either end or start off a comic, it would be I think a shift of eras type thing, of like seeing a big character like this kind of go out, and just like, I assume the Order of the White Lotus, you'd have to involve them a little bit more. That's a way to bring them back into play, and potentially at this point start to bring some of our characters into the Order of the White Lotus, and that we know Zuko gets involved. We assume Sokka would have to be involved. It seems like that's the sort of organization he'd probably like to be involved in. So those type of things would be very, very cool to see. Even if it would be a very sad thing for Bumi. So that has to happen at some point in the next, probably like 30. No, wait. What am I even saying there? Like, realistically, that has to happen in the next, like, 20 years in universe, probably, that King Bumi dies. Just because, while I do still think it's an option that Aang could name his son Bumi after a living Bumi, I think the idea of, like, in honor feels a little bit more meaningful. But still, like, depending on how they do it, whether it just be like him dying from old age, which probably would be the thing, it would be a big kind of, end of an era type thing. Last one I have here would be Melina and Hakoda getting married, and I suppose adding on to that as a more of a theory thing, potentially having a child together. I feel they did enough with this relationship that, they probably have a little bit more to do with regards to, like, Melina and Katara's relationship, really getting that to a good place. But it feels like Melina and Hakoda probably will get married at some point. And that would be a notable thing for Katara to kind of have a, mother figure, officially kind of in her life again. And then the idea of, I suppose, them having a child would be very interesting in that they did do it with the, like, obviously Zuko obviously has a kind of half sister and so on. So it'd be interesting to see it done here as well. In that, I don't feel like if it did happen that it's just something like, oh, that makes no sense because why was this character not brought up? I think it's very reasonable that it could have happened. But at the same time, I think maybe they could do it just like them getting married is enough. But I think they probably would do that. I do think that is an option. That would be a way to, have that marriage happen. That maybe Aang learn from this and how it happens about, like, oh, this is how, like, a Southern Water Tribe marriage works. So, like, this is potentially how I should approach asking Katara or something like that. Like, because that's sort of what we're looking for. We obviously know that the traditional stuff is more up in the north, but that the south still has some aspects of tradition of their own, even though it's more open. And this would, of course, I suppose, be a combined north and south wedding as well, so that would be quite meaningful. And it will allow Aang to learn stuff, and depending on what you do, it could lead into, hinting at, some of our characters, if this takes like a couple of years to happen, hinting at the likes of Mei Zuko, Sokka, and Katara, moving towards marriage, I suppose. Just because you're getting towards the point where, like, if you time skip enough, where, like, the relationships that have been together for a while probably would want to move towards this. Because I assume the Fire Nation people and whatever way the tradition works up there, it's probably one of those things where they like to have their leader kind of have a fire lady as soon as possible to just keep the bloodline going type thing. And so on. But there's a lot of stuff they can do in between these comics. This was just a couple of ideas, some of it very specific comic focused, some of it just stuff that kind of just has to happen between comics, but that's it. And a lot of it's very general. Like, they can commit to doing a lot of these kind of little things at any time they want. The only big arc, really, I think, would be the Azula arc, and then when they're really getting down to making the big decisions about Republic City, that probably is like a story of its own, and they'll probably just build up to that with small little moments in the current comics. But there's no, like, obvious thing of, like, oh, it makes sense for, like, Team Avatar to do this exact thing next. Where they ended off north and south leaves us very much in open air with regards to where we go from here, because, like, we assume the team will probably stay together. It could be a thing where maybe you kind of have the characters maybe just kind of split off a little bit. Like I said, Sokka go on vacation here, and Katara maybe go here. Maybe they find the Sky Bison, and Toph has time to focus more on the business stuff and so on with the school and the company with her father. Maybe you bring Toph's mother back into things. That's probably another plot point I probably should have mentioned on the lists here. Poppy Beifong, like, reunite the whole family. That would be a cool thing, because obviously the issue there, I think, was very much like her Toph and her father, and then the mother kind of leaving in a way because I suppose she sort of blames the father for some of what happened. So her coming back into play would make sense. You obviously have the opportunity with like Mai to also have her be visiting her father in prison, Ukano. Now that he's a somewhat well-developed character, you can maybe begin to bring that family back together. You could potentially start to develop Tom Tom as a character now that he's somewhat old enough to talk and so on. So there are options. Lots and lots of options. So in the comments, of course, let me know what your thoughts are on what I said in the video, but also let me know what are some of the ideas that I maybe didn't mention here. What stuff do you think kind of that we sort of know happens in between now and Korra that we need to see in the comics at some point. But yeah, that's been the video for this week. Thanks for listening, and bye.